What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 208. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to cover today: Israel, Pentagon, and news on the Biden-Putin phone call that happened yesterday. But first, I just wanted to take a minute, as this is the last episode of 2021, to thank the audience for all the support over the past year. The show has been hugely successful. I'm able to do and maintain this full time, the show, antiwar.com, working at the Libertarian Institute. And it's because of all the support that, you give the show, either by buying your CBD at Paloma Verde, donating to the show, donating to the Libertarian Institute, donating to antiwar.com, sharing the show, recommending the show, and telling other people like, hey, check out this great foreign policy content, and this great show that's independent media, covers news stories, listening to what's actually happening. And so, I really love what you guys are doing and really appreciate it. It's what keeps the show going. I wouldn't be able to do this if I wasn't having people listen and support the show. So anyways, it's absolutely awesome that everybody does that. And I want to bring a bonus show this week because I missed the show last week, but anyways, I was looking at like kind of end of year numbers and looking at some of the goals I had set for the show at the beginning of the year, and of course exceeded all those expectations that I had for the show. And so just another reason to bring everybody a bonus episode to give you an extra thank you for everything you've done for the show in the past year. As always, you can find everything that I'm actually putting out at the Libertarian Institute. Check out the viewpoints at antiwar.com. and do your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. Use the promo code PEACE. You get yourself a discount. You get the show a kickback. All right, let's just get into the show. Got a lot to talk about today. First, on Israel. This from the end of November 24th, Israel signed an agreement with Morocco when the Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz traveled to Morocco. And this deal laid out increased, intelligence and military cooperation, and was supposed to lay the groundwork for deeper defense commitments, and that includes weapon sales from Israel to Morocco. And then within a week, on November 30th, we had the announcement from an Israeli reporter, I believe, that Morocco bought unmanned suicide drones from an Israeli aerospace company for $22 million. And so just, for a little bit of context on it, this is happening as a part of the Abraham Accords. If people will remember, towards the end of the Trump administration, desperate for a foreign policy win, they look to get different Arab or Muslim countries to normalize relations with Israel and ignore the plight of the Palestinians, which is one of the causes that the Arab states had previously said was their reason for not normalizing ties with Israel. And so, rather than, the U.S. pushing Israel to improve humanitarian conditions and treatment of the Palestinians, the U.S. said to the UAE, we'll sell you F-35s and armed drones if you normalize ties with Israel. And the UAE went for this. For Morocco, the U.S. recognized the Moroccan occupation of the Western Sahara. There's, this is an area that I'm not super read up on, but my understanding is there's like 500,000 people in a territory that is known as Western Sahara, that's somewhat stateless, I guess, ambiguous as to, who would or is the internationally recognized government there. But the Moroccan government, essentially occupies it and subjects these people to poverty and everything like that. And so, maybe the suicide drones would be used for that. And, some people have compared this to the situation in Palestine. I really don't know enough about it to say for sure, but I do feel pretty comfortable saying that, Morocco commits human rights abuses against at least some of the people in Western Sahara, and certainly wouldn't want to be a government that you're arming. And this is part of the U.S. Abraham Accords that facilitated this, and why, at the time on the show, I wasn't, going along with so much, even of the independent media that was saying these Abraham Accords are some great thing, that it's peace deals in the Middle East and things like that. And I was saying, no, these aren't diplomatic deals. These are essentially weapon sales. At the very best, they create arms races, because after the U.S. agreed to sell the UAE F-35s, then Israel said, well, you have to sell us more advanced technology because we have to have a qualified military edge over all the other Gulf Arab states. And, this is enshrined in like U.S. law and all that. And so this has actually created more weapon sales, not more peace, and just more examples of it here. Some of the biggest news around Israel over the past month and a half, I guess now, has been the NSO group and its Pegasus spyware. Now, I'm sure people in the independent media were very familiar with this and have been discussed on the show over the past couple of years. But there's been, just scandal after scandal where this spyware has been used by several companies or countries, and governments to spy on journalists, dissidents, activists, opposition, even Americans. And that's, what I think finally caused the U.S. to sanction the NSO group and really start to the avalanche of news that we've gotten about how serious this is. And so in the past on the show, I've discussed how this Pegasus software was used on Facebook users, and Facebook was suing the NSO group over it. It was used against Palestinian human rights organization groups. Somebody had used it to spy on the Saudi dissident Jamal Khashoggi, who was, of course, killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, his body dismembered by a team of Saudis, which, by the way, I was just reading today, The Guardian is reporting that 3 members of the kill team, including, people deeply involved, not, just some guy who drove the hit team there, which, that you're a part of the crime and everything. But, they're talking about the forensic expert who helped to dismember Jamal Khashoggi's body. They're talking about the guy who dressed in Jamal Khashoggi's clothes and then left the consulate in an attempt to make people believe that, he wasn't murdered there. And they're living in, I guess, very nice villas in Riyadh and just, being lavished. And this is, of course, in a country that, has beheaded activists who are under the age of 18 for, opposing the government and things like that. Absolutely unbelievable. Also, I did want to mention, I think I had said this on the show in the past, but I just wanted to make sure I said it again. There was a story in November that France had arrested somebody they said was a member of the Jamal Khashoggi hit team. But then a couple days later, they released the person, saying that it was a case of mistaken identity. And so I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. I feel like there's more of that story to be told, but I just wanted to mention that person was released, and apparently not one of Jamal Khashoggi's assassins arrested in France. Let's see. Spyware also used on activists in Egypt and India, and on the phones in Egypt and India, there was also the Israeli spyware known as Cryots. I'm not sure. I don't have as much familiarity with this, but I've seen this name pop up several times. And so my guess is that it's going to continue to show up in the future. Also, U.S. Diplomats in Uganda had the Pegasus spyware on their phone. And so, yeah, this has been a major scandal over the past couple of months. Again, mainly because Americans were targeted. Even the Jamal Khashoggi thing didn't get as much attention as you would think, as he was a Washington Post journalist who was killed and dismembered by a government. And Saudi Arabia or Israel, excuse me, in response to like the US sanctions of this whole scandal, has reduced the number of countries that it's going to export this technology to from 102 down to 37. 102, that's like half the countries on earth apparently had access to this technology. Wasn't able to find a list either way on the countries still included, the countries excluded. I'm sure that, we could pretty easily slot like 50 or so countries into one of the two categories as to, who got booted and who is definitely in. Like, I'm sure the US wasn't barred from having access to this, but they did report that Mexico, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE were all on the list of countries that will no longer have access to technology from the NSO group. And I guess that probably extends beyond just the Pegasus software, but that is the main export. The other thing I want to mention on this was that the sanctions on the NSO group, and while, I don't recommend sanctions, they're economic warfare. At the same time, this is a semi-government agency that's exporting spyware to be used by governments all around the world on dissidents. It's really disturbing. So not really concerned about these sanctions, but those sanctions are apparently having a pretty big impact on the NSO group. And there's at least reports that it's having financial trouble. I'm not sure how true all that is. Trying to get the financial reports of a quasi-government spyware development agency. A lot of it is probably propaganda, but it could actually be in financial trouble. All right, so some other news on Israel is going with the West Bank first. This story from Haaretz detailing how the Shin Bet, an intelligence officer, the Shin Bet is Israel's intelligence agency or one of them, and I guess maybe closer to FBI. Mossad would probably be more equivalent to the CIA. But anyways, this one of their intelligence officers, as a part of this group, provoked a 14-year-old boy. And so what happened here is you had 14-year-old Ahmed Abu Sultan, and he was killed by the IDF after lighting a Molotov cocktail and then was shot from 5 to 10 feet away by an Israeli soldier at an upward angle, and it doesn't seem like there's any dispute that he was lighting a Molotov cocktail. The reason that this is disturbing as I was saying, was disturbing about this case is what led this 14-year-old boy to be lighting the Molotov cocktail. After he was killed, I guess his father went on his social media and found out that he was interacting with an Israeli intelligence officer who, wasn't reporting on interacting with this boy, reporting on crimes, but was rather, saying antagonistic things in private messages to this young boy who, was responding, but you're a grown man. And so I think this really is a factor in why the kid was in a position to throw this Molotov cocktail. Now, I think it's bigger than just what this intelligence officer did as well. There's his parents were saying, and I've read about this before, that, part of it's so ingrained in the culture that so many Palestinians end up, going to an Israeli jail. I think, I read reports that it's upwards of 50% total of Palestinians. That includes men and women who at some time are put in an Israeli prison. And it's 25% of Palestinian women. So it's well over 50% of Palestinian men who has sometime been arrested by Israeli forces. And so there's something of a almost, I don't want to say like a rite of initiation kind of ritual, but likely, this is far more of a PTSD like response where if all of your friends are, getting in trouble and, subjected to this kind of treatment, that you're going to put yourself in a kind of position to have that happen. And so even his parents are saying he was out there to get arrested, and a lot of his friends had recently been arrested. right? And so they don't think that, his real intent by throwing the Molotov cocktail was, to hurt any of the soldiers or anything like that, but, rather to be arrested to, like, not just be with his friends, but to, like, be of the same status as his friends, to have that same shared experience as his friends. And I'm sure that, again, that this probably has a lot to do with, some like PTSD that the Palestinian children face growing up in the brutal Israeli occupation, that they face in that apartheid state. So anyways, that's, I guess, most of the important details of this story. And just kind of wanted to bring that up, example here of what the occupation, what the apartheid state is doing to these Palestinian kids, and how it, creates almost a narrative for the Israelis to say, look, these little kids are so violent, we have to gun them down. But really, it's the Israelis, fostering that culture, and when they're not willing enough to go out there and harass Israeli soldiers, then the Israeli soldiers will harass the kids online until they go out there and puff out their chest and try to confront them in real life. And obviously the inappropriate thing going on is the adult attempting to troll the child on the internet. Absolutely disgusting. Then we have this also from Haaretz, a story of three young Palestinian boys who were accused, I believe, by the Israelis of throwing rocks or something trivial like that. The Israelis come to their homes at 10 p.m., which I'm sure is well past these young boys' bedtimes, and then they take them from their home and they drive them around for hours and hours. They, don't really let them go to the bathroom as they need to. I think they made one of them like go to the bathroom outside at one point, but they also let them outside in very cold conditions for a few hours. Now, it doesn't seem like this was cold enough to cause any like health effects. It's not like the kids were going into hypothermia. However, this is unbelievable ways to treat preteens, right? Not that it would be acceptable to treat teenagers or even adults in this way, but to do it to, people who are clearly children, right? 11 years old isn't even, remotely, can't even, start to sprout chin hairs or anything like that. And so to do it to these young kids and, treat them worse than you would treat dogs is, again, just this whole culture of apartheid that you have in Israel. This is all a part of it and reinforces it into this generation of Palestinian kids when you do things like this to them. Have a report here from, I believe, Al Jazeera, going into abuse by Israeli guards at the Daman prison. This is a women prison. The reports say that there's been an uptick in threats, pepper spray, and using solitary confinement as a weapon. Now, a lot of people like to play down the solitary confinement issue, but, if you were thrown in solitary confinement arbitrarily, or for breaking an arbitrary rule or something like that, I think pretty quickly you would see that it's a torture situation. Maybe 24 hours or something at a time for somebody who's acting too violently to be contained in any other way is one thing, but that's, not largely what we're talking about in these solitary confinement prisons. It's people who don't want to do like some kind of heavy work or dissent from the system in some way, or maybe they get in a little scuffle with a guard who was probably being pretty racist and disrespectful to them, and they say here removed prisoners' hijabs and pulled their hair, things like that. You end up in solitary confinement for a couple of weeks. It's a thing that could really do damage to someone's mind. And, I think John Kiriakou once, described solitary confinement as kind of like being in a parking spot that's about the size of it. I'm not quite sure if it's any different in Israel. I would only imagine, though, that it's probably worse. Some reporting here from the Washington Post, and they're actually reporting on numbers from the Israeli military. They say that settler attacks on Palestinians have spiked 150% over the past 2 years. In the past year alone, the UN reports that 150 Palestinians have been attacked or otherwise beaten by settlers just in 2021 alone, with 4 fatalities. And again, this is only talking about settlers, and so this would be the West Bank. We're not talking about, say, any attacks by Israelis on Palestinian within Israel proper. Of course, I guess there's really no Israeli citizens getting into conflicts with Palestinians in Gaza, but the Palestinian or Israel kills a lot of Gazans. They just do more with their military. But as well as the attacks, the UN report also notes that there were 300 incidents of property destruction, including olive trees cut and burned during the autumn harvest. And so, imagine that the kinds of things that you could do to people to really potentially like destroy their lives. Fruit trees would be like burning down somebody's home, right? Or olive trees, because they take a few years to grow and get to the point where they can mature and produce and everything like that. And so there's a lot of capital investment sunk into these olive trees, and I'm sure the families need them to maintain their homes and to continue living their lives and everything like that. And so when the settlers come and burn them down, it's a horrific kinds of crimes that we're talking about here. Now, I did want to mention that I've read quite a few reports in the past couple of weeks of what seems like basically tensions between the more civilian aspects of the Palestinian and the Israeli tensions increasing. Of course, we had this aggregate data coming from even the Israeli Defense Department about the increase in settler attacks, but we also have reports at least of individual incidents of Palestinians attacking, like say with knives or something, maybe at random members of the Israeli population, and that's also problematic and disturbing, and it seems maybe to be a result of the increase in overall violence against Palestinians over the past couple of years. Another thing I want to mention, there has been another one of these stories when you had an incident of a Palestinian man attack what appeared to be a completely innocent Israeli man. I don't know any background context between these two people, so maybe it wasn't a completely innocent attack, but at the same time, I didn't see any suggestion that it wasn't anything other than a Palestinian man attempting to murder an Israeli man at random. And he was able to stab the Israeli man. I don't think the Israeli man died, fortunately, and was stopped by Israeli security forces. They fired, and I think after he stabbed him, started running at the soldiers, and the soldiers put him down with a couple bullets. He was laying on the ground, but then the Israeli soldier executed him. Right. And so this is a disturbing thing that we've seen several times in Israel. This time it was actually endorsed, though, by the Israeli government as the kind of thing that they want to happen. And that's, kind of just the disturbing way that the Israeli government endorses the treatment and the killing of Palestinians. And Ramsey Baroud has a fantastical article on that right now at antiwar.com if anybody wants to look on, how Israel justifies legally the killing of Palestinians. Let's see. We also have human rights groups saying that Israel failed to investigate the shootings that killed more than 200 Palestinians and wounded thousands others at protests along the Gazan frontier in recent years. These are protests that we are first covering on the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, now, of course, on conflicts of interest. Just how Israel gunning down people, including medics, children, people bound to wheelchairs. All these people were gunned down by Israel. Israel says, they're counting all their bullets, they're killing them with snipers and everything like that. It's not, it's not that the kid was killed by a ricochet, or that the kid was, had a gun and was attempting to shoot Israeli soldiers through the fence or anything remotely like that. We're talking about children, young children, hundreds of feet away from the border. We're talking about medics, scores of feet away from the actual border, if not more, with their backs turned, being gunned down, marked as medics, and in no way trying to just take people who had already been shot by the Israeli military, move them away. And that's who Israel was gunning down these protests, and there's no investigation into it. Nobody's going to be held responsible. It was just an absolute slaughter of civilians in the most disgusting way, and it was absolutely publicly available for anybody to watch. You could go out there, anybody Google Great Return March protests and just see Israeli soldiers gun down Palestinians. And of course, if you have any objection to the U.S. giving Israel billions of dollars in military aid, well then, the U.S. mainstream narrative is always you just do that because you don't like Jewish people. Which is, of course, the just biggest lie ever. Let's see. We also have Palestinians facing increased home demolition in 2020, 2021. This is an overall increase or high for over a 5-year period. There were 797 demolition orders given in this past year. Of course, a lot of people around the world are in places where they say it's absolutely unacceptable to evict anybody from their home during a pandemic, and the Israelis are not only evicting Palestinians from their homes, but they're tearing them down or giving them to either settlers. I guess they're not necessarily Israelis. I mean, you could be coming from New York and claim the ability to settle in Israel in a Palestinian home, and they're just giving them away. This data also shows that of 2,550 requests for construction permits by Palestinians between 2016 and 2020, only 24 of them were granted. 0.9%. And of course, if that few are granted, I'm guessing that a lot of people don't even bother applying. And so there would be thousands and thousands of more Palestinians looking to build, but are prevented. And of course, only 24 of them were able to do it legally. This is also why when people say, well, Israel is just tearing down different buildings that didn't have permits in the first place, it's because it's impossible for Palestinians to get permits, that they have to build without them. Israel is planning to build 6 new settlements in Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. I'm sure that this will lead to confrontations if Israel moves forward with these plans. Some of these neighborhoods are near the Damascus Gate, which is, I believe, the part of the boundary of the Arab or Muslim sector of Jerusalem, and then also near Sheikh Jarrah, which is an area that has kicked off a lot of protest already and confrontation, and part of what led to the escalation and the fighting between Gaza and Israel in May of this past year. Israel is also planning to double the number of settlers in the Golan Heights. And while, there are Palestinians here who I'm sure will lose out, this is an annexation of Syrian territory, and Syria is unhappy with this. Of course, Israel says we really don't care and has carried out probably thousands now. We could probably easily well be over 1,000, maybe even to the multi-thousands. Israel airstrikes in Syria over the past 10 years, and Israel says they had no plans of slowing that down. Will continue that air war in Syria through 2022. Let's see. Israel completes its border wall with Gaza. This is a multi-billion-dollar wall. It is not chain link, but fence at least, and if not concrete barrier overhead, and it also digs deep into the ground and it extends out into the sea. Surveillance cameras everywhere. Some of the equipment, I believe, is autonomous weapons, but they're the Israelis are in the command and control center, and then the guns are mounted on the walls and things like that, and so they're able to fire at Palestinians and kill protesters or whatever they want to do without even remotely putting themselves in any kind of possible even line of sight with the Palestinians. So yeah, massive wall going up around Gaza. This is basically a giant prison wall because Gaza is essentially a giant prison camp. Homes in Gaza are coming down as a result of the Israel air war in May. And, a lot of the calculations, I guess, at the time in May that were considering how many people were displaced and dishomed by the Israeli war, counted the buildings that Israel destroyed. But when you bomb and destroy, multi-story, 10, 15-story, and maybe 15 is a little high, but buildings, office buildings and things like that in Gaza, then the buildings next door are going to be, in some cases, damaged so severely that they're also going to have to be brought down as well. And so there's been several buildings that have been torn down since even the destruction of May, from the Israeli airstrikes, because if you drop a 500-pound bomb in the middle of a city or something like that, a lot more than just the initial home that was destroyed likely needs significant repairs or to be torn down completely. In the past week, this happened after Christmas. I think December 28th was the actual date of the event. There was a Israeli military contractor working and doing some maintenance work, as Israeli describes it, on the fence. Now, this guy, I guess, could have been his maintenance work, equipping a gun or something like that. But it was reported that contractor worker was lightly injured by gunfire, and no idea who fired it. Israel responded with artillery fire and is reported to have injured 3 Palestinians, farmers, so civilians. Unclear, I guess, if this is just like a one-off event or if this is something that could escalate into a larger conflict, as we have seen in the past between Israel and Gaza. Some other news on Israel. Israel is denying the UAE the ability to dock tankers at their Red Sea port. This was something that Israel and the UAE had initially agreed to, that I guess Israel has now walked back on. The U.S. is donating here we go. The U.S. is donating $99 million to the UN Relief and Work Agency. This is the agency that provides services to 5 million Palestinians. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention this is, I'm sure the relief agency does some good work, helps some Palestinians, and, prevents some Palestinians from living either in worse poverty or, from dying, making sure kids get the medicine they need, get the nutrition they need and all that. And so I'm not saying that it's a terrible thing to donate money, to the UN Relief Work Agency and the Palestinians or something like that, especially as involved as the U.S. is in, making the Palestinians this poor and contributing to so much to their suffering. Even though, I'm not a huge fan of international aid, and I'll explain why more in a second. But if the U.S. was going to do this, take the money away from what you were going to give, like the Israeli military or something like that, right? Anyways, one of the reasons that it's so disturbing is the UN agency really prevents its employees, which are largely Palestinians, from speaking out on the Palestine issue. And in one sense, you can maybe understand this, that if all of your employees are very outspoken or something like that, it could cut donations that you're getting. But at the same time, if this is essentially the Palestinian Relief Agency, and the Palestinians who are probably English speakers end up there disproportionately and things like that, are no longer able to speak out for the Palestinian cause, is going to really prevent and hamper the Palestinian movement. And it's just, one of the nefarious things that happens with foreign aid. We have the state of Illinois barring its pension fund from investing in Unilever. This is the parent company of Ben & Jerry's, and is over the decision by Ben & Jerry's to not sell ice cream in West Bank settlements. I can't believe that this is still an issue like a year later, that they're still pushing this, but it does show the success and the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States, that they're, punishing U.S., well, I guess formerly U.S. I don't think Unilever's a U.S. company, but Ben & Jerry's is, and has factories in the U.S. and everything like that. And Ben & Jerry's is being punished by American governments, these American state governments, over their decision about a foreign country. Absolutely absurd. And Israel, it was announced, will go ahead and start to give a fourth vaccine dose for vulnerable people. I guess this is 60 plus. They also had talked about healthcare workers in an article I read. Initially, it was reported that Israel was going to move forward with the fourth dose. And then about a week ago, it was, I guess, clarified to say that Israel was going forward with looking into giving a fourth dose. But now it seems that they're going full steam ahead with a fourth dose at this time. All right, so that's all the news I have on Israel. There's a lot that I had, missed on the past month, but a lot of what we have on the show and talk about on the show when it comes to Israel is discussed, like when we talk about Syria or, the Iran nuclear deal talks, which Israel is heavily involved in, even if they're not actually a part of the Iran nuclear deal. All right, now it's time to get into the discussion on the NDAA. This is the National Defense Authorization Act. It's the Pentagon funding bill. It's not every last dime that, goes to the military and everything like that throughout the year, but it's most of it. Dave DeCamp has a great breakdown of it at antiwar.com. Biden signed it, and so now it's officially law. On Monday, President Biden signed the massive $777.7 billion 2022 National Defense Authorization Act into law. The bill authorizes $740.3 billion for the Pentagon, $27.8 billion for the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons program, and $9.9 billion for defense-related activities outside NDAA jurisdiction. Media outlets are reporting the NDAA as a $768 billion bill, ignoring the additional $9.9 billion. Biden initially requested $753 billion for the NDAA, but Congress decided to add another $25 billion to push the increase of the push to increase the NDAA was led by hawkish Republicans who argued that more military spending was needed to confront China. With China being the Pentagon's main focus, a good portion of the spending bill will go towards research, development, testing, and evolution for new weapons technology known as RDT&E. The NDAA authorizes over $117 billion for research, development, and technology evolution, which will be used to develop hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, space and cyber capabilities, and other advanced weapons. The NDAA includes $7.1 billion for the Pacific Defense Initiative, another China-related measure. U.S. military leaders requested the Pacific Defense Initiative to build up forces in the Asia Pacific to further encircle China. Part of the plan includes establishing a network of long-range missiles near China's coast. The NDAA passage comes amid heightened tensions between the U.S. and Russia around Ukraine, and the spending bill includes $300 million in military aid for Kiev. An earlier version of this bill included an amendment from Ro Khanna that would have required the U.S. to end support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, but was stripped in the compromised version. An amendment requiring women to register for the draft was also removed from the NDAA. So that was Dave's write-up. I got a few more just, little details from the bill. It's I think 2,000 plus page. Again, we're talking about $800 billion in spending here. So to try to break down and keep up with all of it would take far more than about the 20 minutes or so I'm going to spend on this on the show. But some other highlights are there's a statement of support for Taiwan within this bill. And so it's, money directly for Ukraine, but Taiwan is also getting a statement of support. A couple of things that were dropped from this bill from earlier versions were a requirement for Biden to sanction Russia over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and there was a removal that would have put a ban on buying Russian government debt, and then it also included a ban that prevents the Pentagon or the Department of Defense from buying any products that come from what they're calling forced labor in Xinjiang, China. And largely, I think that's just a propaganda move for, more U.S. government employees and to enshrine more in U.S. law that China is committing human rights violation, depending on, how far they're willing to go, either committing genocide, doing forced labor, slave labor, concentration camps in Xinjiang, China, against the Uyghurs. I think all of these are overstated. Not that China doesn't carry out human rights violations against the Uyghurs, but that's a genocide, concentration camp, or any of that is a far overstatement. I think even the forced labor is a major overstatement of what's happening in that region. In the bill, Boeing is getting to sell some planes. They're going to have 17 F-15, and that is the S or EX variant that they're going to be selling. And then the Pentagon had actually only wanted 12 of those, and they're also going to sell F-18EF Super Hornets, and the bill calls for 12 of those, and the Pentagon actually requested 0. And so this is Congress going beyond what the Pentagon actually wants to force more planes on them. The Air Force was looking at retiring a lot of planes, including the A-10 Warthog, but the NDAA prevents the Air Force from retiring any Warthogs and requires them to stay in flight. Now, I believe I had talked about this a little bit because in relation to this, Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, the delusional rabbit dog nut job, said, if it doesn't threaten China, why are we doing it? And because this plane provides close air support, he doesn't, really see it having a need in the U.S. arsenal. I'm, I guess, for retiring all planes, so I'm not really going to argue that we should keep the A-10 around, but I do think that there are some military experts who have made some pretty solid arguments for if the U.S. military is going to do what it's going to do, the A-10 is actually a pretty good and pretty reasonably priced option for that. But those planes won't be able to be retired, so they will stay in service along with like the other planes that don't really work well, like the F-35. There is more funding in the bill for F-35 maintenance. However, there are some provisions in the bill that, major asterisk on this. If 7 years down the road the F-35 still isn't working and Congress really wants to, they could use these provisions to restrict the number of F-35s that will in total be purchased by the Pentagon. And so it's because the Pentagon, Lockheed Martin, that makes the F-35 is so over cost and price on the thing. They're saying that if they don't hit certain affordability targets, then it's going to create a situation where they're not going to buy as many of the planes. But I mean, my guess is that if the time actually came for the restrictions to be made, the Pentagon and Congress would say, oh my God, we can't do this for national security reasons. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, whatever they'll have to, whatever the crisis of the day is, they'll come up with it, they'll push it, and then they'll buy more F-35s than they had even intended to in the first place. Because that's usually how these things end up working. There's more money in just other Air Force planes. There's money for refurbishing E-8J stars and money for the EC-37B Compass Call program and the T-7A Red Hawk program, as well as a more, vague, the Air Force Next Generation Air Dominance program, which I'm guessing just is money thrown at anything and probably a part of the $100 billion for research and development. It also includes 4 Reaper drones and 1 Gray Eagle. I think those are both like the same platforms and just in, different variants for different branches. but it will allow the Air Force to apparently retire the NDAA, some KC 130 tanker or KC 10 extended tankers coming up, and then some KC 135 strato tankers. So some planes getting retired, but largely, just more spending, more waste. Speaking on the F-35s, I just want to mention that a huge problem with them is apparently the green glow, and this makes it really hard to fly the planes at night, and it's more to do with the headset than anything else. And so some branches are figuring this out. I think the Navy and the Marines have made some progress on fixing it, but not the Air Force. It's absolutely unbelievable that if one branch doesn't have the problem fixed at all, wouldn't have it very quickly, including the Air Force, which I believe has the largest fleet of F-35s. Unexpectedly. So the bill has some reforms on sexual harassment in the military, but Kirsten Gillibrand, who's really been pushing this, put out a statement alongside, by the way, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, who are, pretty solid, red Republicans and everything like that, criticizing, saying that essentially the overhaul and what they stripped out of the reforms that she wanted essentially kneecapped any of the actual reforms on how this is going to be overhauled. And very disappointed about that. Sexual assault is the major problem in the military, and that they're unwilling to address it to this extent is really, really disappointing. The NDAA will require the Pentagon to brief Congress over our allies' reaction to potentially changing the U.S. Nuclear policy and adopting a no first use stance. I'm not sure how this is ultimately going to play out. I understand that this was pushed to be in the bill by HOTS, who are hoping the Pentagon will come in and tell Congress that you cannot let the president adopt a no first use nuclear policy. I think it's going to maybe be revealing if any of this becomes public. I mean, you could have something like Israel saying, well, if America adopts a no first use policy, then the U.S. can never nuke Iran because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, or, something along those lines. That could actually, I guess, be more revealing to the war state. But at the same time, my guess is they're going to try to weaponize this to prevent America from adopting a no first use policy, which basically says that we would never launch nuclear weapons first. And, if the entire world adopts, well, not entire, but, if the world's nuclear powers adopt and really stick towards a no nuclear first use policy, that could be a really significant step in making sure nuclear weapons are never used, and we could celebrate New Year's in 2023, make it through another trip around the sun without a nuclear holocaust here. The NDAA prevents Joe Biden from using funds to close the Guantanamo Bay facility. At the same time, they're actually upgrading the Gitmo facilities. There's a good article on this right now at antiwar.com, maybe in the blog section, I think, by Brett Wilkins, detailing the new court facilities they're building there. But very unfortunate that we're not yet going to close this torture prison and try to rectify the Bush torture program, preferably by throwing George Bush and Dick Cheney in jail. And then last story on the NDAA, it includes $50 million in funding for the USS Connecticut, but my understanding is that this is only initial funding for repairs on the USS Connecticut, and the $50 million initial number signals that the final number is going to be absolutely massive. Of course, this is the nuclear-powered submarine that ran aground somewhere or ran into something in the South China Sea. And a lot of questions on what exactly happened with that, why it happened, how it happened, that haven't been answered. And my understanding is the NDAA does not tie the getting answers to the Pentagon getting funding to rebuild this ship. And that would be a way to actually get them to answer. All right, other news from the Pentagon. The Navy P-8 Poseidon was damaged by a truck on a runway, and this is apparently a Class A mishap, I guess they call it, which means it's going to cost at least $2.5 million. Now, this being a Class A mishap and costing $2.5 million at least suggests to me that this is the highest level one, and $2.5 million could be the absolute bottom, and it could be hundreds of millions. I don't know. These planes are very expensive, and so it could be a very expensive fit overall, and I'm guessing we're not going to get any actual details anytime soon on that. The Air Force wants the new B-21 Raider. This is the long-range bomber that the U.S. is trying to build next. It wants it to be able to operate with a team of 5 unmanned aerial vehicles. I don't know if this is even possible, but it sounds like it's going to cost us a lot of money. The Navy is working on a new sailboat drone, and I don't know how notable this is, but I did want to bring this up because the article here from the Navy Times is titled, "The Navy is testing this adorable sailboat drone," and that is calling any kind of weapon adorable as inappropriate, disgusting propaganda. The Navy tested a laser weapon in the Gulf of Aden. This is laser that's mounted onto a U.S. ship. I'm not sure what kind of ship it is, and it was used to take out another ship, a small boat or drone that they said was, simulating carrying explosives. I'm not sure exactly how small this boat was, if we're talking like a bass boat or a yacht or some kind of like flat bottom fiberglass speedboat, something like the Iranians would use, a little bit larger. I'm not sure. I didn't see many details on it, but that they're using lasers and claiming to take out ships is a pretty crazy thing that the Navy is doing right now. I want to update the case of Stu Scheller, who was the Marine who criticized and called for accountabilities of Pentagon leaderships in wake of the Afghan withdrawal. He's now been removed from the military. Any dissident must be removed. If the military was more critical, I guess you would want somebody like this involved who's willing to stand up and publicly call out the leadership and demand, because something really wrong did happen at the end of Afghanistan throughout the entire war, and calling for accountability and for investigations to happen and all that would be huge. But that's not how it works. The military is about conformity, not only in what you wear and things like that, but also in your ideas. And you have to be, dogmatically and devoted to whatever narrative is being put out by the military and the war state at that time. Have a report now that weapon sales have been up in 2020, and the U.S. is cashing in big on this. I think it was only an increase of 1.3% in 2020, but still, pandemic year for an increase to happen is quite shocking, right? All these world governments claiming that they have to lock down their people and everybody else has to prioritize everything in their lives around the virus, but yet they're just going to continue to waste money on their military industrial complex and, fighting their own little power struggles. Absolutely absurd. Major U.S. corporations like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Boeing racked in $180 billion. Just can't imagine that we live in a world where people aren't more upset that you have these companies making weapons and just taking so much money from the taxpayers at a time where so many people have so little. The Army is using TikTok for recruitment. Don't have a lot of details on this. Apparently Marco Rubio was outraged when he found out about this, and so hopefully this gets prevented and not down, but at this time it seems that the Army is using that. So if you have any young children who use TikTok, know that the Army could be, looking to groom and prey on them through that app. This from Idris Ali, who's the Reuters Pentagon reporter. He says that after, January 6th and questions about whether the National Guard was mobilized quickly enough, it's now official that the Secretary of Defense will have the sole authority when, approached with a request to provide the National Guard to D.C. I think this is maybe the wrong move. DC is kind of an interesting place, right? It's not like Oklahoma, where it's kind of easier to say, well, the Oklahoma National Guard, the Oklahoma governor should make those decisions. But in DC, I would still, I guess, rather like the mayor or somebody make these decisions and put the process outside of the federal government, and particularly the executive, because the Secretary of Defense is a executive appointee, right? The U.S. sanctioned 3 people in Brazil over affiliations with Al-Qaeda. Don't really have any other details on who they are, but kind of interesting that, it's Brazil. This is South America, not the Middle East, and it's an AQ designation. Ann Wright continues her great reporting on what's happening to aquifers in and around Honolulu, Hawaii, where, citizens are exposed to jet fuel in their drinking water, contaminated drinking water. So, she's been doing a lot of great writing on this since this summer, and the situation has just continued to seem to get worse. That, the leak happened. It happened far earlier than they said it did, and a lot of the other tanks are at potential for leaking. And so I'll recommend checking out what she's writing for us at antiwar.com, and also other websites around the internet, like this one at Popular Resistance. And here she goes into an interesting aspect of this, which is how hard is it going to be to actually make sure all this fuel gets out of the lines that are used to carry water into people's homes, right? Because, now that the water has been contaminated, and since everybody, the Navy said it was fine, and people continue to use this water for who knows how long, it's not really clear at this point, that, it means that the lines all the way from, the aquifers all the way to people's homes and right up to their ice makers are all contaminated. And so they're saying that, ice maker lines will have to be replaced, that it takes a lot of water to flush out all of the jet fuel. It's not just like you run it all through one time and you wipe your hands and you say, all right, we're good now. These particles stick to the I think largely petroleum lines that are petroleum-based kind of lines that are used for to carry water. And so it's not just as simple as saying, okay, we ran some water through and everything's clear. And, Ann Wright really wonders, Ann Wright wonders if that is actually being carried out to the extent it needs to be, and I really doubt it. She also has some great background in here that people should know. These are fuel tanks that were built during World War II. There's 20 tanks. I think 18 of them are currently in use, and they could each hold 12.5 million gallons of fuel. They're, she says, as big as 20-story buildings, 250 feet high, and 100 feet in diameter. And so these things are absolutely huge, really old, leaking. They don't get inspected absolutely nearly enough, and they remain a massive threat to the people of Hawaii. So again, follow Ann Wright's work and keep up with what she's doing and saying on this, because it's really important. All right, quick, story I want to mention here. I think it's pretty interesting. The president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, said that there's an in-principle agreement, with North Korea and China to bring a formal end to the Korean War. This is a ceremonial thing, but apparently he says the major sticking point at this time is North Korea is unwilling to fully commit to it because they want the U.S. to remove their hostile position towards North Korea first. And so I'm guessing that's a dead end, right? The U.S. isn't going to remove that, which is unfortunate, but the U.S. isn't going to remove their hostile policy, at least not with the current talks that I'm thinking are going on. And so I don't think this is going to go anywhere, but one of the reasons I want to talk about this is we are coming up on the end of Moon Jae-in's presidency in South Korea. I guess the way it works in South Korea is you at least can't run for consecutive terms. I'm not sure if he can maybe run again one day, but he will not be president coming up pretty soon. And this was a guy who I think really was a true believer in trying to get something done with North Korea. It was essentially stymied by U.S. presidents the entire time who didn't want an agreement done with North Korea and between North and South Korea for whatever reason, and just weren't willing to help when they had an absolutely willing partner in South Korea to do that. And it could be that the new president of South Korea is not so interested in having an agreement, or would see opportunity in having a more hostile policy against South Korea or North Korea for whatever reason, and actually be a worse negotiating partner than the Americans or something like that. And I think the US really missed an opportunity with Moon Jae-in to have some positive diplomacy with the North Koreans. And I don't understand Korean politics that well, so I'm not sure what's going to happen in this upcoming election. So I don't want to say that after Moon Jae-in's out of office, no more chances. But I think a key chance was probably missed here. All right, so Biden and Putin talked. We have somewhat differing statements from the two sides. The Russians said that the talks were overall a success, and that Putin warned Biden against major sanctions, that this could lead to major actions by Russia. It's unclear exactly of what those are, if it would be dissolving the diplomatic relationship completely. Gilbert Doctorow has a good article on it. It's on the blog at antiwar.com as of today, so you could check it out there. And one of the things he's saying is that there's a lot of things that Russia could do, including at least starting to threaten strikes against NATO military assets in certain countries, which could provide some kind of interesting problems going forward, and I'm sure would be used as propaganda by Western warlords, but at the same time maybe would be understood as a threat. And look, if Russia fired, let's say, one missile at some kind of missile battery that the U.S. maintains in Romania or Poland or something like that, what would the U.S. do in response? Would it see that as the start of a war, or would it decide that it wasn't worth it to respond to that like low-level Russian attack or something like that? So there's a lot of interesting stuff in that Doctorow article. I recommend checking out. He's not claiming that that's definitely the path. He's just saying like, hey, this is one of the many options that could be on the table here, and something that the U.S. I think really needs to consider. The Biden administration Biden laid out two paths for Vladimir Putin. Apparently, they said either you could engage in like serious and substantive talks, or a path of like resistance or something like that, and that would be met with more U.S. sanctions. So I'm not sure how much progress was made here, but that the Russians called it successful was a good sign, and I'm expecting more reporting on this call, hopefully, to come out in the coming days. Maybe something specifically was discussed, but it seems like both leaders kind of just said these are our thoughts and red lines right now, and that seemed to be a lot of what happened actually at the previous video chat between Biden and Putin. So we are about 10 days now from the start of talks between the U.S. and Russia on the security proposal that Russia put forward. It will be Wendy Sherman, who's the Undersecretary of State. Not exactly a great sign leading the U.S. side in the talks, although it's not somebody like a Victoria Nuland, and that would be terrifying. So there's maybe some okay news there. But yeah, that's what I have on the Biden-Putin talks. That's the reporting that I'm seeing now. Somewhat more optimistic, I think, somewhat more positive from the Russian side, although Putin's did include a warning that was somewhat ambiguous and yet to be seen exactly what he is trying to convey with that warning, and then Biden per se in the two paths from the U.S. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up for today, or actually the year for the show. Hope everybody's really enjoying what I'm doing here. Again, a ton of great stuff coming next week. A big announcement on the show next week. sure regular listeners of the show won't be surprised. But anyways, big announcement that I'm excited for. Scott Horton coming on the show next week. Year-end review show. Subscribe to the show. Rate, review the show. Promote the show. Thank you, everybody, so much for letting me do this and, listening to what I do here. And I can't wait to continue to bring you great content in 2022.